Samagata Bhaktivinoda Chitai
Gaur Premanande Hari Hari Bo Gauranga. Guruve Gaurachandraya Radhikayai Tadalaye Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tadbhaktaya Namo Namaha. Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Jata Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha Om Agyana Timirandasya Anjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangam Langayate Kalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Namo Mahabhajanyaya Krishna Prema Pridayate Krishnaya Krishna Namne Gaura Tishe Namaha. Nityanandam Namastubhyam Premananda Pradayane Kalau Kalamasha Nashaya Janava Shvambaro Dvijavaro Yuga Dharma Palo Bande Jagat Priyakaro Karunavataro Panchatattvatmakam Krishnam Bhakta Rupa Swarupakam Bhaktavataram Bhaktakyam Namami Bhakta Shaktikam. He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priya Jayatam Suruto Pangor Mamamanda Matergati Matsarvasva Padam Bojavo Radha Madana Mohano Divyad Vrindaranya Kalpadrumadha Srimad Ratnagara Simhasanasto Srimad Radha Śrīla Govinda Devo Preshtalibhi Sevyamano Smarami. Shriman Rasa Rasadambhi Vam Shivata Tatakstitaha Karshan Venu Swanair Gopir Gopinata Shriyestuna. Bhaktya Vihina Aparadha Lakshay Kshiptascha Kamari Taranga Madhye Kripa Maitvam Sharanam Prapanna Vrinde Numaste Charanara Vindam. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. First of all, I'm offering my unlimited Koti Koti Dandavat Pranams at the lotus feet of my most worshipable beloved Gurudev Nitya Leela Pravishta Om Vishnupad Paramahansa Ashtatarashata Sri Śrīla A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupāda. And then I'm offering my same unlimited Dandavat Pranams at the lotus feet of my most worshipable beloved Siksha Gurudevs Nitya Leela Pravishta Om Vishnupad Paramahansa Ashtatarashata Sri Śrīla Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Goswami Maharaj and Nitya Leela Pravishta Om Vishnupad Paramahansa Ashtatarashata Sri Śrīla Bhaktivedanta Narayan Goswami Maharaj. I offer my Dandavat Pranams at the lotus feet of all of my Sri Sri Rupa Nuga Guru Varga. And I offer my Dandavat Pranams to all of the Vaishnavas and to all of the Vaishnavis. So I thought it would be very nice to read something, but that has to be decided because there's two options that I have in front of me. Actually, there's more than two options, but this is one book is titled Vaktrtavali, Garland of Divine Discourses, His Divine Grace Bhaktisiddhānta, Sarasvatī Ṭhākura, Prabhupāda. Let's look at the introduction. It's all in topics. Yeah, so, here's the introduction. This is written by Ishwar Das. He's a African-born devotee from Nigeria, I think, West Africa. And he also took Siksha. In fact, he took Diksha as well from Srila Gurudev. I don't know if he took Harinam and Diksha or just Harinam. Only Harinam. But his name, Ishwara Das, that he does a lot of publishing. He's been publishing a lot of books over the last 10, 15 years, living in Vrindavan. And like, for example, Srila Narottam Das Thakur's Prarthana songbook. He did that. And that was like 20 years ago. And, but Gurudev gave him initiation and he gave him the name Ishan Das, but he doesn't use that name for his publication and so forth. Anyway, I want to read a bit from the introduction because the introduction will tell us how where is the source of these lectures. Okay, here it is in the introduction. This book, Vaktrtavali, consists of 43 lectures presented in 3 sections. These are not essays written by disciples, but Sundarananda Vidya Vinod's handwritten capturing of the lectures as they were given. The majority of them have appeared in the Gaudiya, the official mouthpiece of the Gaudiya mission established by Srila Sarasvatī Prabhupāda. Sripad Sundarananda Vidya Vinod was its chief editor. People often think Srila Bhaktisiddhānta Saraswati's words difficult to understand and shy away from reading them. However, a real seeker of the Absolute Truth will not limit him or herself because the language is difficult. And we know that even those who are illiterate can be blessed by such hearing. We have tried as far as possible to render these lectures originally given in Bengali fluently into English without losing the original meaning. Though some of Srila Bhaktisiddhānta Saraswati's expressions are difficult to translate, we have dared to try as his humble servants. Our prayer is that you will find great benefit by reading this book. So the translator is Bhumipati Das. And he's the one that did the whole Chaitanya Bhagavad and so forth. Yes. There's so many sections in this book. I'll give some little overview here. There's the introduction, and then the first section is titled Vaishnava Philosophy. And what they've done is they've given, they've kind of divided the lectures into sections with subtitles of the sections. So the first subtitle is The Definition of Philosophy and the Function and Characteristics of the Internal and the External Senses. So that starts at page 5. Then page 6, So Dasha Darshan, or the 16 Types of Philosophy. Then page 7, Evidence and that which is made evident by Vedanta. Same page 7, the cause of the illusory understanding and an example. Page 8, the in different countries. So in that way, this is the first section. Now, I don't know, yeah, it seems, because he said there was how many, like 43 or something lectures. So.
And what disciple of Srila Sarasvatī Prabhupada was doing the note-taking?
He says here, Sundarananda Vidya Vinod. He was well-known scholar and kind of like on that level of Ananta Vasudeva during the Gaudiya Math time, right?
He worked with Ananta Vasudeva.
He worked with him, yeah. They were both very scholarly. But he's the one that had developed Srila Bhakti Pramod Puri Maharaj was also involved with that. Because I can't imagine that it would be possible, for someone, only one person, to be able to catch all of that. So that's not mentioned here, of course. So I'll just read a few of the titles of the topics of these lectures. So the first one, Vaishnava philosophy. The second one, an address on Vyas Puja Day. Next, Kala Dharma, or the nature of time. Thakur Bhakti Vinod's contribution. Festival of Sri Nanda Maharaj. The daughter of Rishabhanu, that's a whole lecture. The appearance of Sri Madhvacharya. The place of Vaishnava philosophy in the world of religion. Srila Udaran Thakur, Sripad Ishwar Puri, Srila Jagadish Pandit, the present Yuga Dharma, address on Vyas Puja Day, then regarding Sri Rupa and Sri Sanatan, Pancharatrik Diksha and the conception of Varna, Atma Dharma, or the propensity of the soul and mental speculation, Sri Chaitanya Dev and his teachings, transcendental religion and mundane religion, Pushti Marg. Very interesting topics, all these lectures. Amazing. Pure devotion and pseudo-devotion. The soul's eternal propensity. The supremacy of mankind. Srimati Vrishabhanu Nandini. Sridhar Swamipad and Mayavad. Sri Gaur Nityananda. Sri Chaitanya's compassion. Sri Gaura's mercy and Krishna Samkirtan. Religion for the 3 yugas and Krishna Nam Kirtan. The glorification of Srimad Bhagavatam on Vyas Puja Day. The glories of Sri Gaura's abode. Mahaprasad. Sri Govinda. The path of Rupanuga Bhajan. Popularity and truthfulness. Sri Baladev. Sri Krishna's appearance. The Vaishnava. The appearance of Sri Sita Devi. The truth about Srimad Bhagavatam. The service of Sri Krishna. The recitation of Srimad Bhagavatam on Vyas Puja Day. The congregational chanting of the holy name. And the last one, the eternality of service to Hari. I'm whetting my appetite by reading this. So, this is Vaktrtavali, a collection of 43 lectures. Garland of Divine Discourses by His Divine Grace Bhaktisiddhānta Sarasvatī Ṭhākura Prabhupāda. This was printed some years back, 2014. I remember when this first came out, Bhumipati Prabhu on the East Coast, that Bhumipati, he was very excited about this, and he used to quote from this a lot. And in his... Okay, so that's one item. The other item is Sri Gita Govinda by Srila Jayadeva Goswami. But there is an introduction by Srila Bhaktisiddhānta Sarasvatī Ṭhākura, which is pretty amazing. You've read that.
A few times.
Yeah. And let me see. Yeah. It's the foreword of this book. Oh, there's a short foreword by him, by Bhaktisiddhānta Prabhupāda, and on Sri Gita Govinda in general. And then the lecture, the article that he wrote, is adapted from Sri Chaitanya's teachings, chapter 14. That book, Sri Chaitanya's teachings. So the title of it is On Eroticism. We won't be able to get through the whole thing. I don't think so. But whatever we can, that is very valuable. So, why is he writing this on this topic? Why is this included in the book Gita Govinda?
He's screening the readers to...
Mike?
It's actually kind of a warning. He's screening the readers that the following subject matter should not be misconstrued as having anything to do with this mundane world. Although there's correspondence, as Srila Prabhupada used to refer to it. And I think even quoting Srila Bhaktisiddhānta Sarasvatī Ṭhākura, Prabhupada said that the material world is a perverted reflection of the spiritual world. And what's highest in this world is lowest in the spiritual world, Brahman. And what's lowest in this world is the highest in the spiritual world. So.
And what's the unique feature? Because you read this a few times, you said. What's the unique feature and the points that he's putting forward?
Well, he's challenging those who would dare to say that Krishna's activities are immoral, that Krishna is not under the rules of the material world. And I think he even makes reference that the mundane marriage in the material world is seen as the center of religion in this world, but it's nothing but a concession for what's actually illicit. He's pretty strong at that point. But what Krishna does, because he's the only and supreme enjoyer, is having relationships with his parts and parcels. But what is done in this world is not constitutional, because no one is actually in that position of being the enjoyer. Their only glory is to be enjoyed.
So he begins this article by saying the sexual principle is a misunderstood symbol of reality. Misunderstood. Now, listen carefully how he introduces this point. This principle that is within everyone, all living beings. So it's completely misunderstood because Prabhupada's introduction to the Srimad Bhagavatam, and he says in the first purport of the first verse that this Srimad Bhagavatam is really made of the Adi Ras, the term Adi Ras, the original rasa, from which all the other rasas come, and that is conjugal love. That is Madhurya Rasa. So he says, Srila Prabhupada is, Bhaktisiddhānta Prabhupada is saying here, it can no more be banished, the sexual principle can no more be banished from our consciousness than consciousness itself. No, because it's an integral part. So it's very interesting how he develops this point. The male and female forms are also not the sole and distinctive possessions of this world. In other words, just because the male and female forms are here, they are not the actual original forms. They appear in this world, but he says that they are also not the distinctive possessions of this world. There is reality behind them as well. Actually, Srila Prabhupada writes in his Chaitanya Charitamrita purport, in the first chapter of Adi Lila, there's a purport there, and he's making the point, actually he's really presenting Srila Bhaktisiddhānta Sarasvatī Ṭhākura's purport. So he's making the point that unless one is attracted to the transcendental rasa of the spiritual world, one will be forcibly dragged down to the mundane rasa of this world. It's unavoidable. So, he says, there is reality behind these male and female forms of this world. And he says the soul has a body, which is symbolized by the female form. It's symbolized by that, the soul, the Atma, and which is absolutely free from any unwholesome material association. That we know. Our Gurudev told us very clearly in his preaching mission. So now he's going to point out about the ascetic. What is an ascetic? Person who does austerities, tapasya, and like that, controlling his senses, etc. Male sex, that is a necessary factor of our conception of amorous love. What's he telling?
It's impersonal.
Without appreciating the reality that has been created by the Supreme Lord, one's only left with impersonalism. So there has to be an appreciation of his creation to understand he as a creator.
So he's beginning by saying that the ascetic has some repugnance. Why? Because he understands that the temporary form of this world is only drawing one into continued traveling in the cycle of birth and death and so forth. So there's a repugnance. That repugnance, it actually stands in the way of a correct and proper, unprejudiced examination of what is this, the female sex, that is a necessary factor of our conception of amorous love. This amorous love is the highest subject of human poetry and the most powerful factor in all human activities. What did he just say? He just said that love, what is the subject? What is the highest subject that is written about by the greatest of all poets, even just mundane poetry, human poetry? Oh, this is the highest, the subject of amorous love. You cannot have songs, you cannot have life, you cannot have culture, you cannot have anything without that being there on a pedestal, worshipped by everyone as being the most desirable thing. So it's not, that's coming from the soul, because our eternal relationship with Krishna is a feminine relationship, because we are Prakriti. Even the spiritual world, the male forms in the spiritual world, they're also Prakriti, because they're Krishna's servants, and they're exchanging rasa with Krishna, the center. But everything there is supporting the exchange of Madhurya rasa. You know the song that we sing every morning, Jai Radhe, Jai Krishna, Jai Vrindavan. So at the end of the song he says, Jaya Jai Ujvala Rasa, Jaya Jai Ujvala Rasa, Sarva Rasa Sar. All glories to the Ujvala Rasa. And Ujvala Rasa means the radiant topmost rasa, like Unnata Ujvala Rasa. Of who? Of Srimati Radhika and the gopis. And here he's telling Sarva Rasa Sar. This is the actual essence of all ras, is this, Ujvala Ras. Then he says, Parakya Bhave Jaha Prajete Prachar. In Braj, this is the most complete rasa, the essence of all rasa. And it manifests itself in Braj Lila as Parakya Bhav, unwedded. And that's why mundane people who have a problem examining Krishna's pastimes, they always judge this from a mundane point of view. Because it's abominable in a mundane point of view. You know, having a paramour lover and so forth, from the material level. But from the spiritual level, it's the highest. It's the highest. And Brajete Prachar means that all of the Braj pastimes are ultimately promoting this, supporting this, you see. So, he's saying that this amorous love is the highest subject of human poetry and the most powerful factor in all human activities. I remember Srila Prabhupada, he told, you probably remember this as well.
Economics.
You can guess? Okay, guess what I'm about to say.
Economics, yeah.
Huh?
The economic principle?
Well, no, it was actually pertaining to his disciples.
Oh, okay.
And so there was some suggestion by one of the sannyasis that it's better if we take all the ladies and we send them to Australia. All the ladies. Because that was the time of the Radha Damodar party and all brahmacharis, right? This came to Srila Prabhupada's ears, right? And what did Prabhupada say?
Said a number of things. One thing is the whole movement would collapse. But he also said...
But why?
Because the ladies are doing so much.
Okay, but what else did he say?
He said if the men are so agitated, they should be the ones to go to the forest. Because they're going to be preaching among the population that they can...
Yeah, he did. He said that. But there's also one important point that he made. Even though you have in Prabhupada's movement, the males are on one side, the females, and like that. That's all properly divided, Vedic division, and etc., right? So he said, oh, if you take the women away, what enthusiasm will there be in the brahmacharis to do kirtan and everything else? You cannot eliminate that. It has to be purified. And in fact, that was one of the unique features of Prabhupada's very early preaching. And when I came, I've said this a number of times, I was extremely impressed by the ladies, how pure they were, in comparison with what I had seen and grown up with and all of that. But they were like, just incredible, wonderful, pure-hearted, feminine devotees, you know. And lust was not really anything prominent there. That was not really something that was disturbing, because all of us went on Sankirtan together, and we were chanting the holy names together. I remember being on the street in downtown Detroit, and there's like sometimes 25, 30 devotees, at least half of whom are all the ladies. And it was such a wonderful, wonderful event. Even before I moved into the temple, I saw them at that rock festival on Randall Island in New York. They were coming from the New York temple. And there were so many there, and I was watching them. They had such purity on their faces. So, this is the point that Srila Prabhupada, Bhaktisiddhānta Sarasvatī, is making here. He's saying that the amorous love is the highest subject of human poetry and the most powerful factor in all human activities. All. Politics, sociology, economics, everything. Its worthlessness is not established by refusing to recognize it as a part of our nature. In other words, you can't cancel it out. Oh, this is worthless, not needed. Like the example I just gave. He said, you cannot establish just by trying to put forward that this is of no value. Huh? And what is that arising from? Refusing to recognize it as a part of our nature. It would be much more to the purpose to try to understand what it really is. That's what this whole article is about. What is this? The Srimad Bhagavatam is the only book that answers this all-important question. Yeah. Then he says, the worship of Sri Radha Krishna is held by some modern thinkers to be dangerous and even immoral. They apparently take exception to the erotic element, which is the prominent aspect of the highest worship of Sri Radha Krishna. Which aspect? The erotic aspect. That's what's the title. On eroticism, sacred and profane. So, now Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he teaches us that it is obligatory for everyone to pay homage to spiritual amour that characterizes the highest service of the divine person. What does the word amour mean? It's a French word.
Yeah, I see.
You know the meaning?
An armoire?
Amour. Amour. It's spelled A-M-O-U-R. Amour. Amour.
Love?
Yeah, it means love.
But it specifically refers to unwedded love, amour.
Okay. Yes. But the point is, like he's already said, you cannot separate this. Amour. So he's saying that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is teaching us that it is obligatory for everyone to pay homage to spiritual amour, spiritual love, that characterizes the highest service of the divine person. Who is the divine person? Shri Krishna and Radha. Their conjugal, their relationship is that spiritual amour is the characteristic of the highest service. Haven't we not been exposed to that continually? And Srimad Bhagavatam, like he said, this is the only book that answers that question. So he says, this is the central topic of Srimad Bhagavatam. That means that spiritual amour that characterizes the highest service of the divine person is the central topic of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Without Shri Krishna's pastimes with the gopis in Braj, the Srimad Bhagavatam would not be on that pedestal. So, this is the central topic of Srimad Bhagavatam, which deals with the transcendental service of the personal absolute. Transcendental service. So, now he says spiritual amour is the highest service to divinity in his most complete manifestation. Whose most complete manifestation? Him, the supreme divinity. That's Krishna. It says most complete, because Krishna also has his expansions and so forth. And they're all complete, but there's different degrees of completeness. There's Purnam, there's Purnatara. Purnatara means more Purna, more complete. Then there's Purnattama. That means most complete. So no form of the Absolute is as complete as this supreme divinity, namely Krishna.
In Vrindavan.
In Vrindavan, of course. Yes. So he says the real nature of divine personality can never be fully understood by those who are unable to appreciate the preeminent excellence of his service by amorous love. So in other words, if someone is unable to appreciate what is narrated in the Srimad Bhagavatam by the highest devotees who are preeminent. Preeminent means topmost. And how excellent the purity and excellence of their service. Through what? Through amorous love. That is the highest service to the Supreme Absolute. The conception of personality that is available to us in this world, right? Because we're all persons. We have these bodies. We're all persons. But the conception of personality that is available to us in this world, it necessarily refers to the gross human physique combined with convention-ridden human mentality. These two are the definite contents of the conception. The function of such personality can have meaning only if they supply the needs of the body and of the mind. Man is connected with the entities of this world for the satisfaction of the needs of his body and mind by 5 varieties of relationship in this world. Shanta, Dasya, Sakya, so-called, right? So, we are connected with all the entities of this world. Man is connected, the human being is connected for the satisfaction of the needs of the body and mind. Without relationships, how can we live? There's no human culture, human society. So these 5 modes, these 5 relationships, they exhaust all possible forms of such relationship. A person may stand in the relationship of impartiality to other human beings. Impartial. Not coming in actual active relationship. A person may stand in the relationship of impartiality to other human beings. However, the emotional forms of relationship may be said to begin with the relationship of the servant towards his master. So in other words, he's saying the relationship of Shanta, of neutrality, that's the first, right? Isn't it? Shanta, then Dasya, then Sakya, Vatsalya, Madhurya. So he's saying a person, he may try to stand in the relationship of impartiality to other human beings. Like, in other words, not having any active, interaction with the other human beings in these other 4 relationships. So, however, the emotional forms of relationship, emotional forms, they may be said to begin with the relationship of the servant towards his master. Because there's a relationship, there's a rasa there. There's an emotional relationship there. This is characterized by the sentiment of distant respect for the master. Not so close, some distant respect. The relationship of friendship, it is closer than that of servitude. Parenthood is still more intimate. Consorthood, as of the wife or mistress to her husband or lover, is the most intimate and comprehensive form of relationship possible with another entity. The chain of relationships is completed by the reciprocal relationships of master to servant, friend to friend, child to parents, husband or lover to wife or sweetheart. There is no reason not to believe that the 5 forms of relationship are also inseparable concomitants of the personality of the absolute being. He's talking first about what's here in this world. But he says there's no reason not to believe that the 5 forms of relationships are also inseparable concomitants of the personality of the absolute being. However, they are free from the fetters of the gross physical body and the materialistic mind. Those relationships with the absolute being. Consorthood, as of the wife or mistress of this world, is not eligible by itself to set the tune for the other relationships. Mundane consorthood is compelled to shrink, and this is a very important point that he's making here. Mundane consorthood is compelled, in other words, it must shrink, at least outwardly, into the strictly private and personal corner of the affairs of this world. It is not welcomed for influencing other activities in an explicit manner. It can act openly only within the limits of extreme privacy. You can expand on that?
It would be uncomfortable if it would be otherwise. And so it has to remain a private affair. And I guess I'm certain that Srila Prabhupada Bhaktisiddhānta will say, in contrast, in the spiritual world, it influences everything.
Yeah, but first he's going in a certain direction with this now. because he's pointing out why this cannot be embraced within the mundane realm as it is in the transcendental realm. Now, he makes this point now. Consorthood is nevertheless recognized as imparting its deepest charm to life in a world in which it would not be worth living devoid of this relationship. So, what can you say? Even though it has to shrink into extreme privacy and this and that within this world, but yet it has to be recognized that it imparts the deepest charm to life in a world in which it would not be worth living devoid of this relationship. Everyone in this world is, however, compelled, despite this fact, but still everyone is compelled to repress more or less the working of this admittedly deepest principle of his individual nature on account of what? Of the opposition of the uncongenial environment in the shape of the defective organs through which it has to be exercised. Yes.
It reminds me of some teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Prabhupada said that.
How Srila Prabhupada makes this point in the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. He said, actually, in this world, conjugality is impotent. He said, in the spiritual world, everything keeps increasing unlimitedly. He says, where in this material world, there is weakness, and even the principle of enjoyment cannot be sustained for very long. He writes that in TLC.
Right. So, he's just mentioned that the reason why everyone must repress more or less the working of this admittedly deepest principle of his individual nature. Why? On account of the opposition of the uncongenial environment in the shape of the defective organs through which it has to be exercised. So we know this is the sex principle. But in the material world, it's going on through the defective, mundane organs, which are being exercised even by dogs and cats and all the other species, right? So that's the external connection to that principle. It can't be avoided in the material world. That's why it has to shrink, as he said, into, how did he put it? Compelled to shrink into the strictly private and personal corner of the affairs of this world. It is not welcomed for influencing other activities in an explicit manner. No. It can act openly only within the limits of extreme privacy. So now, after making this point about the defective organs, he says, but this cannot condemn the principle itself that is the ruling force of life. That principle is the ruling force of life. It operates with no less predominance, but with less weight of responsibility by being driven underground by the blind opposition of an unsympathetic environment and gross sense organs. That's what drives it underground. Should we deliberately deny ourselves the benefit of the guidance of well-considered opinion in this most vital and important affair of life? Should we deny ourselves? all the great religions scrupulously avoid, and they forbid any examination of this all-important subject. This worship of Sri Radha and Krishna, the worship of Sri Radha and Krishna, is the only exception to this rule. You'll find it nowhere else, in no other religion. The worship of Sri Radha Krishna has been the subject to much easily avoidable misunderstanding bred by sheer ignorance and easily welcomed prejudices. The personality of Sri Krishna, the eternal divine lover of Sri Radhika, is the premier spiritual male of the realm of Braj, which is the eternal abode of the divine pair as depicted in Srimad Bhagavatam. This is thought to be an unworthy conception of the absolute personality, and even as the survival and historical myth of a national hero in the times of promiscuous sexuality and primitive barbarism. So he's pointing out how these persons who are misunderstanding this highest principle, this purest principle of the divine pair of Radha and Krishna, it's all completely misconceived. So he says, hostility to the divinity of Sri Krishna is entertained on the ground that morality should constitute the kernel and the pervading principle of religion. Morality. He's bringing up this point. Morality. That's immoral. We should not, however, forget that this advertised morality is at best only a regulative and restrictive principle. That's all. We are so much wedded to the indispensable nature of this moral regulation that it requires no small effort of the imagination to admit that moral intervention would be uncalled for and it would be harmful but for the actually defective nature of our present environment and our sense organs. It keeps on coming back to that. It would be irrational to do away with moral regulation as long as we are compelled to remain in our present defective condition. In other words, you need to have this moral regulation, this restrictiveness in human culture and human society regarding this principle. Namely what? Marriage, culture, separation of the sexes, so all of this is essential in the material realm, that morality. But he says, but there must surely be a plane that is free from all defects. It must exist. Not just this plane, which is full of defects. No, there must be a plane that is free from all defects, being the natural and the eternal sphere of the activities of our unadulterated spiritual nature. The plane of divinity is superior to that of our conditioned souls. There is no need for any form of restrictive morality in the spiritual world, where the soul is not subject to the limiting operation of his present material and mental adjuncts. The moral principle, like in this world, it presupposes the existence of a strong and spontaneous tendency for evil, as being innate to the human nature. That's the moral principle. How are all laws made in this world? All laws of government and so forth. Well, it presupposes that there's this existence of this strong and spontaneous tendency for evil as being innate to the human nature. The good in this world is in a state of perpetual conflict with the dominating evil. Moral regulation thus becomes the indispensable and the permanent outward expression of the suppressed good life. Of the suppressed good life, meaning the opposite of the evil. Right? So the good in this world is in a state of perpetual conflict with the dominating evil. Moral regulation thus becomes the indispensable and the permanent outward expression of the suppressed good life. Moral obligation. It has to be there. It's indispensable. However, on further analysis, we discover that moral judgment can take its stand only on an attenuated form of the evil that it ostensibly seeks to eradicate. I'll read that one more time and then you can explain it. Okay? Because he's an editor, he knows. Now, he's saying, on further analysis, however, we discover that moral judgment can take its stand only on an attenuated form of the evil that it ostensibly seeks to eradicate. It does not advocate acceptance of the substantive good. In other words, without that evil, you can explain that.
Well, it's only a negative, not a positive, that's being postulated here. The Judeo-Christian tradition, which includes Islam, only says that there's original sin, and that all living beings thus tend to evil. And part of that evil is the pursuance of sex, or even the pursuance of domination, predatory behavior in other forms, killing, stealing, and all these things. And so there's regulations against them because it's thought that this is the actual nature of the living being. So it's a very negative view of our essential nature, where Srila Bhaktisiddhānta Prabhupāda is saying, no, actually the higher nature, the real pristine nature is of a different sort, which doesn't require the regulation of reality in this world, but can be exhibited in a pure and unfettered fashion in the spiritual.
Right. Now, the biblical story, you've all heard, right? Adam and Eve in the garden, right? And God created Adam and then Eve from a rib from him and so forth. So the first two human, man and woman, right? And they're living in the Garden of Eden. Now, of course, this is allegorical. It's very allegorical. But from the viewpoint of the Vaishnava philosophy and proper understanding of the absolute truth, so we can also harmonize, we can also understand. So what occurred there in the Garden of Eden? In the Garden of Eden, they were living. There were no descendants at that time. They had no offspring, no children. There was just the two of them and all the other species, animals and so forth, which according to the Bible, they're given dominion over the human form. But then came another instigator. Who was that?
The serpent.
The serpent is who?
Satan.
Satan. Satan representing the evil tendency. Now, what did he do? You've heard this story before, right? What did the devil, the Satan, what did he do in the form of a serpent? You haven't heard this before.
I've heard, but
You can't remember. Okay. So this is good. We're reviewing it.
So you do eat an apple.
What he did was he was winding himself in a tree, and there was no farming, anything. All the fruits, everything, they lived.
orange.
Yeah, it was just very no difficulty, and they were happy, and they also had no clothing on. They had no clothing on. So Eve was standing underneath this tree, and then this devil, evil element took the form of a serpent in the tree and began to speak to Eve. What did he say to her? I forgot to mention, because God told Adam and Eve that you can eat from all the other trees, but this tree here, don't ever eat the fruit from this tree, because this tree is called what? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What is good, what is evil? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So they were obeying that. Adam and Eve were obeying that. But one day, Eve was standing there near to the tree, and the serpent came and began to speak to her. And do you remember what the dialogue was?
Yes.
Tell. This is very interesting. I grew up with this. Yes.
So in the shape of a snake, he was tempting Eve that, did God say you could eat from all trees or all fruits?
Mm-hmm.
And Eve said, well, we can't except for one tree.
Mm-hmm.
And then Satan said, oh, well, that's because if you do eat from that tree, you'll become like God, knowing
Yes.
good and evil.
Uh-huh.
And so she became curious
Yes.
and decided to eat from that tree. And,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. He kept on coaxing her.
Yeah.
Because she was like, but God said we shouldn't. But God said we shouldn't.
There were commentaries, medieval
Yes.
commentaries about this that
Right.
were extremely sexual.
Uh-huh.
Did you know that? So they knew that allegory was
Yes.
all about
Mm-hmm.
the forbidden fruit.
Right.
It's basically having sex as pleasure rather than for propagation. But anyway, it's a whole other.
Yeah, okay. So, now this is also the reason why in Judeo-Christian, and it's also there in the Vedic, that the female should be subordinate to the male. Why? She's called what? The weaker sex. Right? You ever heard that term? In Christianity, referred to like that. Now, of course, in the modern era, everything's just become completely topsy-turvy, completely. But it is natural. This is the natural, the subordination of the female to the male, right? And even with the creation, there's a rib coming from the male, and now God created the female as the counterpart. Right? So, the allegory of this temptation, this is the first temptation, instigated by the devilish, evil person, Satan, who's always trying to overthrow God, who's always trying to convince others to go against his will, to go like that, Satan. So, gradually Eve became weaker, couldn't resist, and he said, just take one bite, you know? And she did it. She took one bite. That's why on the computer corporation named Apple, there's one bite.
Wow.
Okay? Yeah. So she took the bite, and then what happened at that moment?
She saw, she had a...
Mic. Just keep the mic on the chair, then it's easier for you to...
Well, she had a revelation of knowledge of what is good and evil. I mean, she actually had an enlightenment.
It doesn't describe that so much. That's later. What was described in the biblical Genesis chapter of the Bible, the first chapter, is that immediately God knew what she had done. And
Well, wait, she went to tempt Adam.
oh, that's right. Okay, yeah, narrate that part. Yeah, I
So
forgot about
she
that.
found, well, actually what it says in Genesis is she found that it was good. It actually says that.
Okay.
And so
Yeah.
she wanted that Adam also eat from this tree of
Right.
enjoyment. And then God, then they realized they were naked.
Well,
And they
but first, God came in a very strong voice. You can kind of visualize like thunder, and his voice comes, "You have disobeyed me," So now, you will not be able to live anymore in this garden, this paradise, because now you have eaten the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Go ahead.
Actually, when God first called out to them, Adam and Eve were hiding from him, and he asked, "Why are you hiding?" He says, "Oh, because we were naked." And so God knew, well, if they're conscious that they're naked, then they've eaten from the...
Right. And so then was the casting out from the Garden of Eden by God. And they left having, using leaves and stuff to cover their private parts. And now you see paintings where they're being driven out by God, and he's going like this, and they go out of the Garden of Eden. So then they come into the world as we know it, right? And then the next chapter begins to describe how this evil tendency is there innately within the human being, and their immediate descendants, Cain and Abel, were the two first sons and they fought one another, and then one, I think it was Cain, killed Abel. And that was the first murder, right? And like this. So, this story is hinting on the fact that man is inherently weak and can commit sin and evil activities, right? Destructive. And then the whole, first, what is it called? The Old Testament of the Bible. It's narrating the story of human beings and all of this. So in Christian philosophy, it calls it this original sin. Now, that didn't make any sense to me when I was in my grade school and I'm hearing these biblical stories all the time, that why would we, descendants of the original human beings, Adam and Eve, they're the ones that committed the mistake. Why would we be subjected to have to be influenced in the same way that we have this tendency to sin? Right? That didn't make sense to me. Because we know that there's a thing called the law of karma. Those who are more advanced in spiritual understanding, we know that the law of karma is there. You commit an act, you have to get the reaction. It's not that, even though it's connected with family, that is true. One can also be getting the reaction of when one is in a family dynasty like that, that's also there.
The nurturing.
Huh?
The nurturing.
Yeah, the nurturing, but there's like a karmic principle, even in material mundane law, of descendants whose, parents or grandparents or whatever, they did some very abominable action for which they have to pay. So then the descendants are still liable for that. They're in some cases. Not karmically. Even according to material law, they have to pay the debts. Yeah, they have to pay the debts of the predecessors, right? So the thing is that this is very, very basic. Srila Prabhupada also explained that the Bible is for childlike persons. And there's many, many stories and so forth there. There is substance, there is some truth is there. And, the 10 Commandments, the principles that human beings are supposed to follow, this was drilled into us. And it corresponds with the sins that are mentioned in the Vedas, in Mano Samhita and so forth, Thou shalt not kill, like thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, and so many principles are there. But the New Testament and the biblical teachings now come into the life of Jesus, who was said to be God himself coming in the flesh as the Son of the Father, right? And the whole purpose of his coming was to do what? Was to save mankind who are born into original sin. They can't help but sin, and to save them. And his sacrifice had to be made on their behalf. The sacrifice of his life. His blood had to be spilled in order to eradicate all the sins of the human beings. If anyone believes in him and has faith in him and wants to accept him and embrace him as their guide, as their savior, the savior, then if they do that, then they will be saved from sins, and otherwise they will have to go to the eternal hell, where they'll be punished for their sins. In the Bible, it says eternal. Okay? That was also didn't make sense to me. How can just some superfluous, sinful activities condemn you that you have to suffer forever? I used to think, even me, a human being, I can forgive people, Maybe, okay, they have to be punished for a certain period of time, but forever? If they only have one life, because the Bible does, the way that it's been edited, it took out all the reincarnation conceptions from the Bible, the way it was edited by the Romans when they began to adopt that as the religion of the Roman Empire, okay? Before that, for a few hundred years, Christianity was outlawed by the Roman Empire. You see, it was outlawed. But then this Augustine was one of the emperors, and he had a vision on a battlefield in the sky of a cloud formation of a cross. And everyone knew that that was the symbol of the Christians, that Jesus died on the cross and so forth. So he felt impelled, at least this is what the histories tell, to call together a conference, and all the scribes and all the persons and all the, what do they call those, the scrolls that had been written over hundreds of years, they now were brought together, and then they were going to combine this together to become what is called the Bible, right? And there were the ancient Old Testament scriptures of the Jews and so forth. So they're making the Bible. But the Bible was politically motivated because the law of karma, right? The law of karma. I won't go into that. That'll take too much time.
It was a close vote. It's like a GBC vote.
Yeah, but the queen of this emperor, She was a very ambitious person, and she killed many people in order to rise up to this level. So she didn't want it said in the Bible that she would have to suffer for those atrocious acts. That's one of the reasons. The whole situation was, as you said, it was contentious. There were different sides. So that's why you don't find the conception of reincarnation. And that's why in modern Christianity they don't have the exacting understanding that this body is just dead matter, but it's animated by consciousness, and that consciousness is actually the eternal individual living being, the Jivatma. That is the consciousness. When the consciousness leaves the body, there's no life at all. And when the consciousness enters the womb of a mother through the male, then life begins, the body develops, etc. So we know this. This is very, very basic, and that's the first thing that Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita explains, you see. But for me, coming from the Christian background, I was never, ever told that you're not this body. So that was very enlightening to hear the Bhagavad Gita at that time. Anyway, so the reason why I brought this up is because that's Western civilization has been built upon this principle. And Srila Bhaktisiddhānta Sarasvatī Ṭhākura he is pointing out the flaws in the conception in other religions, or just in general in humanity, of not being able to properly embrace this principle, this erotic principle, which is there in the living entity naturally. So it's not false. Prabhupada used to always explain this. This is not false. This is natural. But in the material world, it's a perverted reflection of the original. And the original is supremely worshipable, pure, pristine. I mean, that's what Srimad Bhagavatam is. So in this way, he said, there is no need for any form of restrictive morality in the spiritual world, where the soul is not subject to the limiting operation of his present material and mental adjuncts. So, on this day before Srila Prabhupada Bhaktisiddhānta Sarasvatī Ṭhākura's appearance day, we read some of his words, and you can see that you have to think deeply. He spoke in a very precise way, and also in the English language. Even Srila Prabhupada, our Prabhupada, said that sometimes he couldn't follow his Guru Maharaj. And I've talked with the editors, like in Gaudiya Math, and they're Bengalis, and when they read his Bengali that he spoke or that he wrote, they're very long sentences. It's like in Sanskrit, you know. Srila Bhaktisiddhānta Sarasvatī Ṭhākura, very long sentences. So that, you know, when the editing is there, then it has to be kind of like broken up a little bit, they were telling. So he is our grandfather, Guru, those of us who are Prabhupada disciples. And he's the great-grandfather, Guru, for those who are disciples of his disciples. No, disciples of the disciples of his disciples. Yes. So, tomorrow is a very important day for the whole world, right? Jagad-guru, Śrīla Prabhupada, his appearance day, and there's so much to discuss and talk about. And we'll be reading, and also the lectures given by Gurudev and Bhakti Pragyan Keshav Goswami Maharaj, like that. So all glories to Srila Prabhupada Bhaktisiddhānta Sarasvatī Ṭhākura ki jai, Sri Gita Govinda ki jai, Anantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai, Samagata Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki jai, Nitai Gaur Premanandi. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Nitai Gaur Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Gaur Hari Bol. Nitai Gaur Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol. Nitai Gaur Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Gaur Hari Bol. Nitai Gaur Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol. Jai Shri Shri Guru Gauranga Gandharvika Giridhari Shri Shri Radha Govinda Ji Ki Jai. Vrindai Tulsi Devai Priyai Keshavasya Cha Krishna Bhakti Prade Devi Satyavachai Namo Namah. Vansha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubheva Cha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. All glory to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.